Samuel Carter was a man time seemed determined to ignore. At 73, he moved slower than he once did, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that even age could not dim. His farm sat on the edge of Willow Creek, a small rural town where everyone knew everyone, and gossip traveled faster than the river after a heavy rain. The locals saw Samuel as little more than a relic-an old man who planted his corn too straight, kept his tools sharper than necessary, and told stories that no one believed. Every evening, when the day's farm work was finished, Samuel would walk into town and take his usual seat at Rosie's Diner. It was a modest place with peeling paint and a neon sign that buzzed faintly above the door. Farmers, mechanics, and truckers came there for coffee and conversation, and Samuel was always waiting, a steaming mug already in front of him. He didn't need to order anymore. Rosie herself, a tough woman with a kind heart, simply poured his cup the moment she saw him shuffle inside, and then the stories would begin. Did I ever tell you about the time I got lost in the Andes? Samuel would start, his voice calm but carrying an unusual rhythm that made people listen even as they rolled their eyes. There I was, 24 years old, no map, no guide, nothing but a rope and a knife. Snow higher than the rooftops, air thin as paper. And still, I made it back down. The younger men at the counter would chuckle, shaking their heads. Sure, Sam, and I suppose you fought off a mountain lion with a stick too? Samuel's eyes would glimmer as he leaned back in his seat. Not a stick, a broken shovel. Still got the scar to prove it. That was how it always went. Story after story spilled from him like water from a spring, surviving in jungles, crossing deserts with little more than a canteen, outsmarting bandits on dusty roads, even describing missions that sounded more like movie scripts than real events. He spoke of coded messages hidden in newspapers, nights spent in foreign prisons, and daring escapes that no farmer should have ever experienced. To the townsfolk, it was entertainment, something to laugh about over pie and coffee. Samuel's tales were as much a part of the diner as the checkered floor tiles or the smell of fried bacon. But behind the laughter was a shared certainty. None of it was true. Samuel had never left the county, they said, except for a bus trip to Kansas when he was young. The idea that this quiet farmer had once lived such a dangerous, thrilling life was absurd. Even so, Samuel never argued when they laughed. He never raised his voice, never tried to convince them. Instead, he'd sip his coffee, smile faintly, and end his tale the same way every time. One day, you'll see. Some thought he said it to keep the mystery alive, a little hook to make people come back for more. Others thought he was just senile, an old man clinging to a fantasy because real life had been too ordinary. Yet, when Samuel said those words, something about the way his eyes hardened, as though staring through the years, made even the most skeptical pause for a heartbeat. Rosie, who had known Samuel longer than most, often wondered why he never defended himself. She would refill his cup and lean close, whispering, "Sam, why do you let them mock you like that?" He'd chuckle softly, his rough hands cupping the steaming mug. "Rosie, truth doesn't need defending. It stands on its own, whether people see it or not." Despite the ridicule, there were moments that made people uneasy. Once, when a young hunter bragged about tracking deer, Samuel casually explained wind patterns, animal behavior, and how to set traps so subtle no creature could avoid them. Another time, when the town mechanic struggled to loosen a rusted bolt, Samuel showed him a trick involving leverage and grip pressure that worked instantly. No one knew where he had learned such things, but they quickly brushed it aside. After all, Samuel was just the old farmer with wild stories. Children, however, loved him. They would gather near his table, eyes wide, hanging on to every word. Unlike the adults, they weren't concerned with truth or lies. To them, Samuel was a living adventure book, each story more exciting than the last. He told them of parachuting into dense jungles where snakes hung from trees, of sleeping under stars in deserts, so vast the horizon seemed endless, and of facing storms at sea where the waves towered like giants. The children gasped, cheered, and clapped, convinced Samuel had lived a life more thrilling than any movie hero. Their parents would shake their heads, pulling them away. "Don't fill your head with nonsense," they'd say. Yet Samuel would simply smile as the children waved goodbye, his eyes softening in a way that showed he valued their belief more than any adult's approval. Still, as years went on, Samuel's reputation as a harmless storyteller solidified. New families who moved to Willow Creek were warned about him quickly. "That's old Sam. Don't take his tales too seriously. He means no harm." And so the cycle continued: stories, laughter, dismissal, and Samuel's quiet smile. Yet underneath it all, there was an unspoken tension, though most people never noticed it. Sometimes, late at night, when the diner was nearly empty, Samuel's voice would lower as he told a tale too raw, too vivid to be invention. His eyes would drift to the window, staring at something far beyond the town's streetlights. The room would fall silent, goosebumps rising on the arms of those who listened. Then, as if catching himself, Samuel would chuckle, lighten the tone, and return to his usual rhythm. No one pressed him about those moments. Perhaps they were afraid to learn the truth, that the harmless old farmer might not be harmless at all. On the farm, Samuel lived alone. His house was old but well kept. Tools hung neatly on walls, and the fields always looked tended with precision. Though his back was bent and his pace slower, he worked with an efficiency that put younger men to shame. Neighbors sometimes spotted him moving at dawn, carrying heavy sacks of grain with a strength unexpected for his age. When asked how he managed, he'd grin and say, "Good habits." But those who watched him closely noticed how his movements carried a discipline more like a soldier's than a farmer's. Willow Creek, however, never looked deeper. They didn't need to. To them, Samuel was simply a fixture of their town, the old man with the endless stories, as much a part of the place as the church bell or the water tower. And so, Samuel remained in the background, quietly weaving his life of crops and stories together. He didn't need belief. He didn't need applause. All he needed was patience, because deep down, he knew something the town didn't. One day, his truth would no longer be doubted. And on that day, laughter would turn to silence. The morning sun rose lazily over Willow Creek, painting the quiet town in hues of gold and amber. Samuel was already awake, tending his rows of corn with the same steady rhythm as always. He liked mornings, the cool air, the birdsong, and the way the world felt untouched. For him, every sunrise carried a reminder of discipline. Work done before the heat, silence before the noise. But on this particular morning, silence didn't last. It started as a low rumble in the distance, a vibration in the earth that made his coffee cup tremble on the windowsill. Samuel paused, leaning on his walking stick, his brow furrowing slightly. That sound wasn't thunder, nor the passing of a heavy truck on the highway. It was the kind of sound he hadn't heard in decades, yet recognized instantly. Engines, many of them, moving in formation. Within minutes, the peaceful rhythm of Willow Creek was broken. A convoy of military vehicles roared down Main Street, dust rising behind them. Armored trucks, Humvees, and even a camouflaged bus filled with uniformed men in dark sunglasses rolled past the gas station and came to a halt near the diner. Children abandoned their bikes to watch, eyes wide. Shopkeepers stepped out to their doorways, shielding their eyes against the sun, whispering with curiosity. The town hadn't seen anything like this in living memory. Samuel watched from the edge of his field. His lips pressed into a thin line, though his eyes betrayed no surprise. He knew the cadence of military movements, the precision of vehicles aligned perfectly, the sharpness of men stepping out in unison. He recognized it all not from movies or television, but from memory. He leaned against his stick and watched as the soldiers moved through the town like they belonged there. By the time Samuel made his way to Rosie's diner later that morning, the place was buzzing louder than a beehive. Every booth was filled, not with farmers or mechanics, but with soldiers. They carried themselves with the confidence of men trained to survive anywhere, their laughter loud, their voices certain. The townsfolk lingered at the counter or peered through the windows, whispering about what was happening. Training exercise. Rosie muttered to Samuel as she refilled his cup. They're setting up camp out in the forest. Government picked our backyard, of all places. Samuel nodded, though he needed no explanation. He studied the soldiers quietly, noting their posture, their relaxed arrogance. Special forces, he thought, not ordinary grunts. These were the kind of men sent into places no one talked about in newspapers. At the far end of the diner, one of the soldiers, tall and broad with a jawline that looked carved from stone, overheard Samuel speaking to a few curious children. He was telling them a tale about crossing a desert, describing how water can be found in places most people wouldn't expect. The children leaned forward, captivated. The soldier laughed loudly. "Hey, old man, you ever been farther than the county fair?" The diner erupted with chuckles. Another soldier added, "He's just filling their heads with nonsense." "Don't believe everything you hear, kids." Samuel looked at them calmly, unshaken. He took a slow sip of his coffee before replying, "I've been farther than you think." That remark only fueled the soldiers' amusement. "Sure you have," one said, slapping the table. "What's next?" "You wrestled alligators in the Everglades? Climbed Mount Everest with a busted leg?" The laughter was contagious, and even some of the townsfolk joined in. Samuel didn't flinch. He simply set his mug down and leaned back in his chair, his eyes meeting the soldiers with quiet steadiness. "Maybe I did. Maybe I didn't. But I'll tell you, this skill isn't proven in stories. It's proven in the field." Something in his tone gave the soldiers pause, though they covered it quickly with more laughter. One of them leaned forward, smirking. "Is that a challenge, old-timer?" The diner grew quiet. Townsfolk glanced between Samuel and the soldiers, sensing a tension brewing beneath the humor. Samuel didn't raise his voice or break his calm expression. He simply shrugged. "Call it whatever you like." That was all it took. Soldiers, especially young ones filled with pride and training, couldn't resist. They whispered among themselves, grins spreading, until one of them stood up, addressing the whole diner. "All right, folks, let's settle this. If this old farmer thinks he's got the skills, let's put it to the test. Out in the woods, him against us. If he can avoid capture for 24 hours, we'll pay for his meals for a year. If not, he admits these stories are nothing but bedtime tales." Gasps filled the room, followed by excited murmurs. A bet, a public challenge. Entertainment for the whole town. Eyes turned to Samuel, waiting for him to back down. Surely he'd laugh it off, refuse, wave it away. But Samuel didn't. He looked around at the faces smirking soldiers, eager townsfolk, wide-eyed children, and then back at his steaming mug. He lifted it, drank the last sip, and set it down with quiet finality. "I accept." The diner erupted. Some clapped, others laughed louder than before. Rosie shook her head, muttering, "Lord help you, Sam." But Samuel only stood, left a few crumpled bills on the counter, and walked out without another word. His boots tapped steadily against the wooden floor, his figure framed in the doorway before disappearing into the sunlight. The soldiers chuckled, among themselves, already boasting of their coming victory. To them, it was sport a way to show off their skill, embarrass the old man, and entertain the town. But among the laughter, a few people remained unsettled. Rosie wiped the counter, her eyes lingering on the empty mug Samuel had left behind. She had seen the way his expression never wavered, the calm in his voice, the certainty in his acceptance. As word spread through Willow Creek, excitement grew. People gathered on porches, discussed it at the gas station, and whispered about it in the grocery aisles. The idea of Samuel going against trained soldiers was outrageous, laughable even, yet undeniably captivating. Everyone wanted to see how it would play out, but Samuel didn't seek attention. He returned to his farm, fed his chickens, sharpened his tools, and moved about his chores as if nothing unusual had happened. That night, he sat on his porch beneath the stars, listening to the crickets. His face was calm, but his eyes reflected something deeper, an old readiness awakening after years of silence. For Samuel, this wasn't a game. It wasn't even about pride. It was simply the moment he had always known would come. The moment when stories would no longer be stories, when truth would demand to be seen. And in his heart, Samuel knew one thing with absolute certainty. The soldiers had no idea what they were walking into. By dawn the next morning, Willow Creek buzzed like it had never buzzed before. The little town, usually quiet save for tractors groaning in fields and birds hauling in the trees, had suddenly found itself in the middle of a drama worthy of headlines. At the diner, at the gas station, on porches with rocking chairs creaking beneath them, everyone was talking about one thing: the bet between Samuel Carter, the old farmer with the unbelievable stories, and the Special Forces team stationed in the woods. People were divided, of course. Some thought it was all a joke, that Samuel had finally lost his mind by agreeing. Others, mostly children, and a few of the town's older folk, whispered that maybe, just maybe, there was truth in his words. Either way, nobody wanted to miss what was coming. At Rosie's diner, the hub of all conversation, the soldiers sat, in their uniforms, laughing and swapping strategies as though Samuel wasn't even a concern. They bragged about how quickly they would catch him, betting among themselves whether it would be 5 minutes or 10. Their leader, the tall man with the stone jaw who had first mocked Samuel, leaned back in his chair and smirked. 24 hours? He won't last one, he declared. The woods belong to us. That old man's going to walk straight into our arms. The others chuckled and nodded, their confidence absolute. To them, the challenge was more of a show, a bit of fun to break the monotony of training exercises. They had state-of-the-art equipment, night vision goggles, thermal trackers, drones, radios, maps, and years of combat experience. Samuel had a walking stick and a satchel. Rosie listened while refilling their mugs, biting back her words. She wanted to defend Samuel, to remind them that he wasn't just some silly old man, but she stayed silent. The soldiers wouldn't have listened. Instead, she glanced at the empty booth where Samuel usually sat. He hadn't shown up that morning. Samuel, meanwhile, was at his farm, preparing. To an outsider, it looked like his routine, tending to the animals, splitting wood, checking fences. But if one looked closer, every action carried a subtle precision. He wasn't just working, he was conditioning his body, moving muscles in familiar rhythms, reawakening skills long dormant, but never lost. Inside his modest farmhouse, Samuel laid out his satchel on the kitchen table. Into it, he placed simple items: a length of cord, a small knife with a worn handle, flint, a tin cup, and a piece of cloth. Nothing more. No firearms, no advanced tools, nothing the soldiers would consider serious equipment. To Samuel, though, it was enough. He had survived harsher places with less. As he tied the satchel shut, he paused, looking at his reflection in the window. His weathered face stared back, lined with years of sun and labor. But behind the wrinkles was the same man who had once stared down storms and enemies alike. He chuckled quietly. Guess it's time they found out. By midday, the entire town gathered near the edge of the forest. Children sat on fence posts, parents stood with arms crossed, and elders shook their heads, muttering about foolishness. The soldiers were already there, laughing among themselves as they strapped on gear. They looked like figures from a movie helmets, gleaming, radios crackling, weapons slung across their backs. Then Samuel arrived. He came walking slowly, leaning on his stick, wearing the same faded shirt and hat he always wore to town. His satchel hung across his shoulder, looking pitiful compared to the soldiers' equipment. Murmurs swept through the crowd. He looked like a farmer going for a stroll, not a man about to take on a special forces team. One soldier barked a laugh. Look at him. Doesn't even have boots built for terrain. He's dead on arrival. Samuel ignored them. He stepped up to the leader, his gaze steady, his movements calm. The rules are simple, he said. You catch me before dawn tomorrow, and I'll admit my stories are lies. You fail, and you buy me dinner for a year. The leader smirked. Deal. Rosie, standing at the front of the crowd, called out, Sam, are you sure? Her voice carried worry, but also a strange undercurrent of faith. Samuel tipped his hat slightly. Never been surer, Rosie. With that, the soldiers formed up, ready to head into the woods. They treated it like another mission, briefing each other, checking gear, ensuring communications were secure. Samuel, on the other hand, stepped toward the tree line, paused, and turned back to the crowd. His eyes scanned their faces, some mocking, some anxious, some curious, and then he gave the smallest of smiles before vanishing into the shade of the forest. The soldiers followed soon after, spreading out in formation. The crowd lingered, for a while whispering, betting among themselves, before eventually dispersing. But a tension hung in the air, as though everyone knew something extraordinary had just begun. That night, while the town slept, campfires flickered at the edge of the forest where the soldiers had established their base. Radios buzzed with confident reports. Teams checked in, declaring they were narrowing in on Samuel's position. Laughter still filled the air, though less frequent now. Meanwhile, Samuel moved like a shadow beneath the trees. Every sound, every scent, every shift in the yell. Wind spoke to him. He placed his feet carefully, disturbed no branch, left no trace. When he crossed streams, he doubled back to erase his trail. When he moved through thickets, he broke no branches, disturbing the forest as little as possible. His every action was precise, calculated. For Samuel, the woods weren't an obstacle. They were home. Back in town, Rosie sat by her window, staring into the darkness beyond the fields. She couldn't sleep. She thought about Samuel's eyes when he'd said he was sure, the unshakable certainty in his voice. It didn't feel like the arrogance of a man desperate to be believed. It felt like the calm of someone who had already survived worse. She whispered into the quiet night, "Show them, Sam. Show them who you really are." The forest of Willow Creek stretched for miles, a patchwork of thick oaks, whispering pines, and streams that twisted through the land like silver veins. To the townsfolk, it was just woods, a place for hunting, fishing, or Sunday walks. To Samuel Carter, it was something else entirely. Every bend, every hollow, every ridgeline held memory. He had walked these trails as a boy, tested his endurance here as a young man, and now, at 73, he knew the woods the way a captain knows his ship. As dawn broke, The Special Forces team gathered at their makeshift base near the tree line. Their leader, Captain Briggs, barked orders with military crispness. Maps were spread across a hood, radios crackled, drones buzzed overhead. Each man was equipped with GPS trackers, night vision goggles, hydration packs, and lightweight rifles, slung across their shoulders. Their camouflage blended seamlessly with the trees, their formation rehearsed to perfection. "This is going to be over quick," one soldier muttered, adjusting his gear. "Don't underestimate him," another replied, though his smirk betrayed disbelief. Briggs glanced toward the woods, where Samuel had entered hours earlier without. A backward glance. "He's just a farmer. We're soldiers. Remember that. Don't let the theatrics get in your head." The men nodded, confident. Yet somewhere deep inside, a flicker of unease lingered. Samuel hadn't hesitated yesterday. He hadn't cracked a joke or tried to wriggle out of the challenge. He'd simply accepted, as though it were inevitable. At that very moment, Samuel was 3 miles into the woods, moving with the ease of a man half his age. His boots pressed softly into moss, leaving almost no imprint. His walking stick tapped the ground rhythmically, not for support, but for listening, gauging the firmness of earth, the hollowness of logs, the vibration of approaching footsteps. Every movement was deliberate, every pause meaningful. He carried no watch, yet he knew the time by the angle of sunlight. He carried no compass, yet he read the moss on trees and the flow of streams. Where the soldiers had equipment, Samuel had instinct. And instinct, when sharpened by years of necessity, often proved sharper than technology. By mid-morning, the hunt began. Teams of soldiers spread out in sweeping formations, their radios filling the air with clipped updates. Drones scanned from above, infrared sensors searching for heat signatures. Briggs, monitoring from base, grinned as he watched the screens. "Nowhere to hide," he said to himself. But Samuel was already thinking 2 steps ahead. When the first drone buzzed overhead, he stood perfectly still under a dense pine, his body blending with the shadows. He knew drones tracked movement more than shapes. He waited until the sound faded, then slipped silently across a shallow stream, his boots barely making a ripple. The soldiers followed the stream minutes later, scanning footprints. They found nothing. "How's that possible?" one muttered. "Keep moving." Briggs snapped into his radio. "He can't be far." But Samuel wasn't just ahead. He was behind them, circling carefully, watching their movements from the safety of cover. He studied how they moved, the gaps in their formation, the reliance they placed on gadgets. He didn't smile, but his eyes hardened with quiet recognition. This wasn't much different from the games he'd once played in jungles, half a world away. Different men, same arrogance. Near noon, Samuel left his first false trail. He bent branches just enough to suggest recent passage, pressed his stick into the soil to mimic footprints, and scattered small rocks across a path to draw attention. The soldiers followed eagerly, chasing the decoy deeper into the woods, until the trail vanished abruptly at a stream. Frustrated, they cursed into their radios. "He's toying with us," one growled. Samuel, hidden on a ridge above, watched silently. His breathing was steady, his pulse calm. For him, the hunt wasn't about speed. It was about patience, about listening. The forest told him where they were snapping twigs, the unnatural cadence of boots, the distant murmur of voices carried on the wind. At one point, Samuel crouched beside a fallen log, his fingers brushing the damp soil. He could smell the faint tongue of oil from their weapons, hear the faint static of a nearby radio. They were closer than they realized. He could have vanished farther, but instead he stayed, testing their awareness. A squirrel darted across the brush, distracting them, and Samuel slipped behind a thicket before they turned. The hours dragged on. By late afternoon, sweat beaded on the soldiers' brows. They were used to harsh conditions, but frustration gnawed at them. Every time they thought they had him, Samuel seemed to vanish. Drones reported false signatures, heat readings that turned out to be deer or wild dogs, their maps filled with dead ends. Their pride began to ache. At camp, Briggs slammed his fist on the hood of a truck. "He's 73. 73. And he's making fools of us." No one dared answer. Samuel, miles away, sat by a stream eating a piece of bread from his satchel. He chewed slowly, savoring the simplicity. To him, this wasn't a battle, or even a challenge. It was survival, something he had practiced for a lifetime. He looked up at the treetops, the sunlight shifting golden as evening approached. He knew the forest would grow darker soon, harder for the soldiers to navigate. For him, though, night was no enemy. As the sun dipped lower, the soldiers regrouped, frustration simmering in their voices. Radios carried their complaints back to Briggs, who barked at them to tighten formations, to push harder. But fatigue weighed on them. They had covered miles of dense forest, equipment heavy on their backs, nerves fraying with every failed lead. Samuel listened from the shadows, his expression unreadable. He could have ended the game early, revealed himself, let the bet dissolve. But deep inside, he felt something stir. This wasn't about meals at Rosie's diner. This was about truth. About the years he had carried stories no one believed. These men, with all their training and pride, would be the ones to prove him right, not through his words, but through their own failure. As night fell, the forest grew alive with new sounds, the croak of frogs, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of nocturnal animals stirring. For the soldiers, it was disorienting, every sound magnified in the dark. For Samuel, it was familiar music, each note carrying meaning. He moved with ease, setting small diversions. A snapped twig placed deliberately to lure them, a trail of disturbed leaves leading to nowhere. By midnight, the men were exhausted. Their tech had failed to pin him down. Their bodies ached, their morale cracked. Samuel, hidden high in the branches of an oak, watched them stumble below. He rested easily, one arm hooked around the branch, his eyes sharp as ever. The hunt was only halfway through, but the outcome was already becoming clear. The old farmer wasn't the prey. He was the predator. Morning light crept through the trees, cutting shafts of gold across the forest floor. For the Special Forces team, it didn't bring hope, it brought exhaustion. They had spent the night chasing shadows, following trails that vanished into streams and circling back on themselves more times than they cared to admit. The woods felt like they were alive, shifting against them, bending around a ghost who refused to be caught. Captain Briggs stood at the edge of a ridge, jaw tight, scanning the terrain below. His men were sprawled around him, checking gear, gulping water, their faces etched with frustration. "We regroup," Briggs growled into his radio. "Sweep. Sector 4 again. He can't be far." But Samuel wasn't in Sector 4. Miles away, the old farmer crouched in the underbrush, studying a deer path. His breathing was slow and steady, his body still as stone. He had chosen this spot deliberately, a narrow trail where the soldiers were bound to pass. Beside him lay nothing more than a length of cord and a few branches, arranged with care. His hands moved with practiced ease, tying knots so quickly. And quietly, it was as though the forest itself was helping him. By the time the soldiers arrived, Samuel was gone. All that remained was a cleverly disguised snare stretched across the path. The first soldier didn't see it until it yanked him sideways, sending him tumbling into the dirt. His rifle clattered against the ground, and his teammates rushed to free him. "God damn it!" He spat, rubbing his ankle. "He rigged a trap." Briggs's voice came sharp through the radio. "Stay alert. Don't underestimate him. But Samuel wasn't content with snares. He left false markers scratched into tree bark, arrows pointing the wrong way. He stacked stones in deliberate patterns to mimic survival signals. He even plucked berries and scattered them across the path to suggest foraging. Each sign drew the soldiers deeper into confusion. By noon, tempers flared. We're being led in circles. One man snapped, kicking at a branch. No, another muttered, his voice tinged with something like awe. We're being played. Samuel, hidden nearby, allowed himself the faintest smile. He hadn't run wildly through the woods like they expected. Instead, he moved methodically, guiding them where he wanted, shaping the forest into a chessboard where every move was his. When the sun reached its peak, the soldiers stumbled upon a stream where fresh footprints pressed into the mud. At last proof of their quarry, they surged forward, following the trail eagerly. But the footprints ended abruptly at a pile of rocks. Crouching, one man lifted the stones and triggered a small cascade that tumbled down the bank, startling a flock of birds. The men cursed, realizing too late they'd been duped again. Meanwhile, Samuel had already crossed the stream upstream, brushing away his real prints with a pine branch. He sat beneath a willow tree, sipping water from his tin cup, his eyes scanning the distance. To him, the chase wasn't about endurance or strength. It was about patience. Let them run themselves ragged. He had all the time in the world. By mid-afternoon, the forest heat pressed down like a weight. Sweat slicked the soldiers' backs, their uniforms clinging. They drank greedily from their canteens until one of them realized his was missing. "What the hell?" he muttered, rummaging through his pack. "I know I filled this." Another checked his gear and found his compass gone. Radios crackled with complaints as more soldiers reported items missing or misplaced. Briggs barked into the comms. "You're telling me an old man is raiding our packs while you're wearing them?" The silence that followed spoke louder than any admission. In truth, Samuel had doubled back during the night, moving silently among their temporary camp. He didn't take much, just enough to unsettle them, just enough to sow doubt. A missing canteen here, a shifted rifle there. He knew the power of small disruptions. Soldiers didn't just fight with weapons, they fought with confidence, and confidence, once cracked, was hard to restore. The tension spread like wildfire. Every twig snap made them jump. Every rustle of leaves drew their rifles up. They weren't the hunters anymore. They were being hunted. That evening, as shadows stretched long across the ground, Samuel prepared his boldest move yet. He found a clearing where the soldiers were likely to rest. Using branches and vines, he rigged a simple but effective trap. A tripwire that released a bundle of thorny brush. Nothing lethal, nothing harmful, just startling enough to send a message. When the soldiers entered the clearing and one tripped. The brush crashed down with a thud, scattering leaves in every direction. Instinctively, the men dove for cover, shouting, scrambling into defensive positions. But the forest remained silent. Then, from the tree line, a calm voice floated toward them. "Evening, gentlemen." Every rifle snapped toward the sound, but there was nothing, just shadows. "Careful where you step," the voice continued. "The forest doesn't take kindly to arrogance." The men froze. None of them had seen him. None of them had even heard him move. Yet his voice carried with unsettling clarity. By the time they rushed toward the direction of the sound, he was gone. Only a single feather lay on the ground, pinned beneath a stone. Briggs clenched his fists, his pride burning hotter than his anger. "He's mocking us," he growled. And he was right. Samuel, perched high in a tree 100 yards away, watched them scatter below. His face betrayed no joy, no malice, only calm resolve. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about truth. They needed to see it with their own eyes, to experience it with their own fear. Only then would they understand. As night fell again, the soldiers gathered near their flickering campfires, their voices subdued. The laughter of yesterday was gone, replaced by muttered curses and uneasy silence. One soldier rubbed his temples. "This isn't possible. He's 73. Another shook his head. "He's something else. I don't know what, but he's not just a farmer." Samuel lay beneath the stars, his back against a fallen log, listening to the forest. His body ached faintly, but his spirit burned bright. He had outlasted worse hunts in harsher lands. Tomorrow would be the final stretch, and he knew they were already broken in ways they wouldn't admit. For the first time in years, Samuel allowed himself a small laugh, not of arrogance, but of relief. The stories he had carried alone for decades were no longer just words. Now they were alive again. And soon the world would know. Dawn seeped into the forest with a chill that cut deeper than the night's cool air. Mist curled along the ground, turning trees into shifting silhouettes. For the Special Forces team, it felt less like morning and more like the forest itself was breathing, whispering, mocking them for every failed step they'd taken. Captain Briggs tightened the strap on his vest and scanned the haggard faces of his men. Their eyes were rimmed red from lack of sleep, their movements heavy. Gone were the confident strides and cocky grins they had worn just 2 days ago. In their place lingered uncertainty, the weight of knowing they were being toyed with by someone they had dismissed as a frail old farmer. "All right," Briggs barked, his voice hard but strained. "We adapt. He's clever, but clever won't. Save him forever. We're soldiers. We stick to protocol." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at the edges of his words. Protocol had failed them yesterday. Technology had failed them. And the man they were hunting seemed tireless, moving through the terrain as if the forest had raised him. Miles away, Samuel knelt by a creek, washing his weathered hands in the cold water. His reflection stared back at him, a face marked by deep lines, eyes clear, but heavy with memory. To the town, he was just an old farmer with endless stories. To these young soldiers, he was becoming something far more dangerous, a reminder that skill wasn't measured in muscle or rank, but in patience and experience. He gathered smooth stones, slipping them into his satchel. Tools, nothing more. Samuel never thought in terms of weapons. The forest had provided him with everything he needed: stones, vines, sticks, water, silence. He rose, his joints stiff, but his resolve steady. Today wasn't about evasion anymore. Today was about teaching. By mid-morning, the soldiers reached a narrow gorge, its steep walls funneling them into single file. Briggs ordered the lead scout forward, eyes darting for any sign of movement. The path was quiet, almost too quiet. Halfway through, a sudden clatter echoed. A cascade of stones tumbled from the slope, bouncing across the path. The men hit the ground instantly, weapons raised, scanning the ridges for movement. But the rocks were harmless, just a pile nudged loose from above. Still, the message was clear. Samuel knew exactly where they were, and he could strike whenever he pleased. "Keep moving," Briggs ordered, though his own heart thudded with unease. What none of them noticed was Samuel's work just beyond the gorge. Using the stones he'd gathered earlier, he had built a decoy campfire in a small clearing, complete with scraps of cloth and footprints leading in circles. The soldiers stumbled upon it less than an hour later, their eyes lighting up with what they thought was a breakthrough. "He's here," one muttered, rushing forward. But when they kicked at the smoldering ash, they found it cold. Hours cold. The footprints spiraled deliberately, leading them back to their starting point. Frustration boiled over. One soldier hurled his canteen into the brush. Another cursed loudly, his voice cracking. Briggs clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain composed, though his patience was fraying. Samuel, hidden high in the branches of an oak tree nearby, watched silently. He didn't gloat, didn't laugh. He simply observed, cataloging every sign of fatigue, every flare of temper. They were unraveling, thread by thread. That evening, things grew worse. As the team set camp, they discovered more gear missing small things, insignificant on their own, but devastating together. A pack of rations vanished. A map was gone. One man's knife had simply disappeared from its sheath. Paranoia spread like wildfire. "You took it," one soldier snapped, shoving his teammate. "I didn't touch your damn knife." Voices rose, hands balled into fists. Briggs had to step between them, shouting them down, but the damage was done. Trust was eroding. The unity that once bound them as brothers in arms was crumbling beneath the weight of invisible hands. From the shadows, Samuel whispered to himself, "Divide and they will fall." The night grew long and restless. Every crack of a branch sent rifles snapping up. Every owl's call was mistaken for a signal. Sleep came only in restless snatches, haunted by dreams of being watched. At dawn, the soldiers awoke to find words carved into a nearby tree. "The forest is mine. Leave while you can." The message wasn't crude or hastily scratched. It was deliberate, precise, etched with a steady hand. Some of the younger men paled. "He's toying with us," one muttered. Briggs's jaw tightened. "He's trying to get in our heads. Don't let him." But even as he spoke, he knew Samuel had already succeeded. Later that day, the turning point struck in full. The team was moving through thick brush when a sharp whistle pierced the air. Instantly, they dropped into defensive formation, scanning for movement. Silence followed. Then another whistle, this time from a different direction. Panic rippled through them. Were there more men? Was Samuel working with others? They spun in circles, rifles raised, sweat pouring down their faces. Then, one soldier shouted, "There!" and fired into the trees. The gunshot echoed, but nothing answered. No enemy, no movement. Just their own fear reflected back at them. When they reached the spot, they found a feather tied to a branch with twine, swaying gently in the breeze. Samuel had led them to fire. On shadows. Briggs's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "Enough. We end this tomorrow. No more games." But Samuel knew the games were already won. That night, as the soldiers huddled in their camp, their fire crackling low, Samuel stood on a ridge overlooking them. The moon bathed him in silver, his figure blending with the trees. He could hear their voices carried on the winged arguments. Doubts, the raw fear they tried to hide. For Samuel, this was more than victory. This was vindication. The stories he had carried for decades were alive again, carved into the minds of men who had mocked him. They were learning the truth the hard way. Age was no weakness when paired with wisdom, patience, and respect for the land. The turning point wasn't just that the soldiers were breaking. It was that Samuel no longer needed to run. Now they were running from him. The forest was quiet as dawn broke over Willow Creek, yet an unsettling stillness lingered. No bird sang, no rustling of small animals disturbed the leaf-strewn ground. Even the wind seemed muted, as if nature itself held its breath. Samuel. Carter moved with deliberate calm, his weathered boots pressing softly into the soil. Today was the day the stories became reality. Today, the special forces would finally understand that the man they had mocked was no ordinary farmer. He had spent 2 nights weaving a web of misdirection, leading them into exhaustion, doubt, and fear. Now it was time to close the trap. Samuel surveyed the clearing he had chosen, a small depression surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. From above, it looked almost ordinary, but for him, every branch, every rock, and every shadow was part of a plan. His traps were subtle yet effective. Tripwires rigged with bundles of thorny brush, false trails that led into dead ends, and noisemakers fashioned from branches and tin to startle and confuse. To a trained soldier relying on technology and brute force, it would seem supernatural. To Samuel, it was simple. Respect the land, move carefully, and let the forest speak. By late morning, the soldiers stumbled into the clearing. They were ragged, their faces smeared with dirt and sweat, uniforms torn from brambles and branches. They were armed, but their weapons seemed to weigh them down more than protect them. "Stay alert," Captain Briggs barked, his voice carrying command but no longer confidence. "He can't be far." Samuel, hidden above in the branches of a pine, watched them like a predator. He could see every movement, every nervous glance. They had no idea that the traps had already been triggered multiple times, leading them. Exhausted and anxious, their reliance on tools, gadgets, and brute force had made them predictable. A young soldier stepped forward, thinking he had spotted movement. He tripped a thin tripwire, releasing a cascade of thorny branches that tore at his uniform. He cursed loudly, stumbling backward. Another rifle shot rang out in panic, striking nothing but air. Samuel moved silently through the upper branches, a shadow among shadows. He whispered to himself, not out of arrogance, but necessity. Every move has its consequence. Every step has its lesson. The soldiers were now completely disoriented. Footsteps crisscrossed the clearing. Officers shouted orders that went unheard, and every rustle of leaves made them jump. They could feel Samuel's presence, though. They could not see him. The forest itself seemed to shift, bending around his position. By midday, Briggs realized the gravity of their situation. "Circle up. We can't split," he ordered, trying to regain control. But cohesion was gone. Some men moved toward the river, others toward the denser thicket. Confusion reigned. Every path they took seemed to intersect with yet another trap or false trail. Samuel, perched in silence, studied their movements. They were predictable, driven by ego and training, yet blind to the subtleties of the terrain. A snare here, a false footprint there, a startled deer rushing past. It was all enough to redirect them. They were no longer soldiers, they were prey. As afternoon approached, Samuel prepared his final demonstration. Using long vines and his knowledge of leverage, he rigged a system of pulleys and branches that would create a small, controlled landslide, a harmless but highly dramatic signal to those trapped below. The forest would appear alive, almost vengeful, and the soldiers would feel the full extent of his mastery. When the men stepped into the depression, the mechanism triggered. Leaves and branches tumbled. A low rumble echoed through the trees, and dust rose like smoke. Panic surged. They fired weapons blindly, calling out Samuel's name, but only the echo returned. From the shadows, Samuel finally made himself visible, descending silently to the ground. He moved with deliberate grace, his walking stick tapping softly against the dirt. He was not threatening, yet every soldier instinctively backed away. "You've wasted your strength," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying over the clearing. "You've relied on tools, on numbers, on arrogance. None of that matters here." Briggs raised his rifle. "Step forward slowly, hands where I can see them." Samuel did, slowly, methodically. The forest around him seemed to hold its breath. "You can't catch me," Samuel continued, his voice calm, almost gentle. "You can try, you can chase, but you are out of your element. The land is mine, always has been, always will be." The soldiers hesitated, realizing the truth. Exhaustion had dulled their senses, and yet the old, Man before them moved with clarity, precision, and confidence. Every story he had told, they were living proof now. Briggs clenched his fists, lowering his weapon slightly. You've been leading us in circles, using tricks and traps. Why? What is this really about? Samuel's gaze swept across their faces. It's about respect, he said. Respect for the land, for experience, for patience. You mock what you don't understand. You assume youth and tools are enough. They're not. I've lived longer, learned more, and paid attention to what you refuse to see. The soldiers, spent and humiliated, exchanged glances. Their pride hurt more than their tired bodies. The forest, which had seemed so ordinary before, was now a teacher, and Samuel its master. He gestured toward the edge of the clearing. You can leave. Go back to your training grounds. Carry your lessons with you. Or stay and continue to fight a game you cannot win. One by one, the men lowered their weapons. Humiliation, exhaustion, and the awe of realizing the truth in Samuel's words overcame them. Briggs remained silent a moment longer, then finally lowered his rifle completely. You're extraordinary, he said, voice hoarse. We underestimated you. Samuel simply nodded. He didn't boast. He didn't gloat. He simply allowed the truth to stand, unchallenged. As the soldiers slowly made their way back to the edge of the forest, Samuel watched them go. He moved back into the shadows, disappearing into the trees as silently as he had arrived. The forest reclaimed its peace. By nightfall, the clearing was empty. Only footprints and disturbed leaves remained, telling no story but one, that an old farmer had outwitted trained soldiers, relying not on technology, not on strength, but on wisdom, patience, and intimate knowledge of the land. The forest had taught its lesson, and Samuel had reminded the world why his stories, once laughed at, were never lies. Dawn broke over Willow Creek with a gentle light, a stark contrast to the tension and chaos of the previous days. The forest was still and calm, dew glinting on leaves, streams babbling quietly, as though nothing had happened. Yet the events of the past 48 hours had left a mark not on the land, which remained unchanged, but on the people who had witnessed the extraordinary. Samuel Carter returned to his farmhouse quietly, as he always did. He had walked the forest at dawn before, but never with such triumph and silent satisfaction. The sun warmed his back, the morning birds sang, and the scent of damp earth filled his lungs. To the casual observer, he was simply tending to his chores, feeding chickens, checking fences. But anyone who knew the story, or who had been present during the challenge, understood that Samuel had changed the perception of Willow Creek, and perhaps of himself forever. The Special Forces team had left at first light, humbled and exhausted. Captain Briggs, a man used to giving orders and seeing results, had spent the night reflecting on the events. Words like extraordinary and unbelievable barely scratched the surface of his awe. The soldiers had been trained for high-stakes missions across the world, yet they had been outsmarted by a 73-year-old farmer, armed with nothing but experience, patience, and knowledge of the land. Briggs lingered at the edge of town, looking back at the forest with a mixture of respect and disbelief. We underestimated him, he admitted quietly to his men. He didn't just survive, he controlled the game. And we forgot what real skill looks like. In Willow Creek, the townsfolk were slowly emerging from their homes. News traveled fast, and soon every porch and corner buzzed with the retelling of the events. Children reenacted the chase with sticks and old ropes, while adults whispered among themselves, shaking their heads in amazement. Rosie's Diner, which had served as the informal headquarters for gossip and bets, overflowed with conversation. People spoke Samuel's name with reverence, no longer merely as a storyteller, but as someone who had demonstrated truth through action. Rosie herself stood behind the counter, wiping it down with a rag, her eyes bright with admiration. She had known Samuel for decades, had heard his tales since she was a girl, but never had she fully believed until now. "He's something else," she murmured to a customer. "A living legend." Samuel appeared quietly at the diner's door, his hat pulled low, satchel slung over his shoulder. He did not boast, did not recount the traps or the exact maneuvers he had executed. He simply ordered his coffee and took a seat, nodding politely to those around him. The townsfolk, for once, were too captivated to speak. They simply watched, knowing they were in the presence of someone remarkable. Even the children, normally impatient and eager for exaggerated tales, leaned forward, eyes wide. They had seen firsthand that this man's stories held more than just entertainment. They held lessons, proof, and a depth of skill that few could comprehend. That evening, Samuel walked through the outskirts of his farm, the sun setting behind him, painting the sky in orange and violet hues. The forest beyond whispered softly, the streams glimmered, and the fields stretched wide and golden. For Samuel, this was home, and yet he knew that the perception of him had changed. He had earned something far greater than validation. He had earned respect, not only from the soldiers who had mocked him, but from the town that had quietly doubted him for years. Captain Briggs, months later, would still recall the feeling of being outmaneuvered, not by technology, not by brute force, but by wisdom and experience. He would tell the story in briefings and training sessions, not as a tale of embarrassment, but as a lesson in humility. No one, he would say, should underestimate the power of observation, patience, and understanding one's environment. In Willow Creek, the story took on a life of its own. Samuel did not change who he was. He still tended to his fields, still worked with his hands, still shared stories over coffee. But now, each tale carried the weight of experience verified by action. Children would gather, asking about traps, strategies, and the mysterious ways of the forest. Adults would nod silently, recalling the arrogant soldiers who had ventured into the woods and returned humbled. Samuel's life continued much as it had before, yet subtly different. The recognition did not alter his routine, but it did deepen his connection to the community. People approached him with a mixture of respect and curiosity, no longer dismissing his words. The forest had proven itself as much a teacher as Samuel had proven himself as a master of its lessons. The soldiers' visits became less frequent over time, but Briggs maintained correspondence, sharing insights and stories about Samuel's strategies. Every letter and report reiterated the same lesson: underestimate the land and underestimate those who understand it at your peril. Samuel's reputation began to spread beyond Willow Creek, reaching corners of the country where his name became synonymous with cunning, wisdom, and patience. At the diner, Rosie placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. "People won't stop talking about you," she said with a grin. Samuel smiled faintly. "Let them talk. Let them remember that the world has room for more than brute strength. Experience counts. Wisdom counts. And sometimes, patience counts more than any weapon." The town had learned more than just the truth of Samuel's tales. They had learned a lesson about humility, about respect for those who walk quietly but think deeply, about the value of observation and understanding. Even the children, who had once laughed at his wild stories, now spoke of him with reverence, eager to learn and listen. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Samuel walked through his fields, the stalks of corn rustling softly in the evening breeze. The forest beyond was quiet, serene, and untouched. The Special Forces team had left. The town had returned to its rhythm, but the story lingered etched into the soil, whispered in the trees, carried on the wind. For Samuel, life continued simply, yet richly. Every sunrise, every stream, every footfall across the earth was a reminder that the extraordinary often exists in plain sight, waiting for recognition. The laughter that had once greeted his stories had been replaced with respect. The world had finally acknowledged the truth he had always known. Experience, patience, and wisdom could outmatch arrogance, technology, and youth. And in the quiet of the evening, as the stars began to pierce the sky, Samuel sat on his porch with a cup of coffee. He watched the forest, the fields, and the town he had long called home. A soft smile crept across his face. The stories, the challenges, the laughter, they were all part of life's rhythm. But now, for once, the world had listened. And Samuel Carter, the old farmer whose tales had once been mocked, finally rested knowing that truth, skill, and wisdom could not be denied even by the finest soldiers in the world. The forest whispered around him, approvingly, as if to say, "Well done."